This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Many of us in the Vermont Edition community care a whole heck of a lot about local issues. We post on Front Porch Forum or our local Reddit threads. We show up for PTA meetings at our kids' schools and debate issues together on town meeting day. But how many among us have run for elected office? It's a significant leap to go from being interested in local politics to being an active part of it. This past legislative session, a number of Vermonters took that very leap. They became state lawmakers for the first time. In Montpelier, they had a lot to learn, from the layout of the State House to how to make alliances and compromises to get things done for their constituents. Over the past half a year, 7 Days reporter Hannah Bassett shadowed two first-time state representatives, Sean Sweeney, a Democrat from Chittenden County, and Michael Booten, a Washington County Republican. Hannah is 7 Days' Ways and Means reporter. It's a special year-long project that details the inner workings of Vermont's legislature and explores how well it represents the interests of citizens. Her cover story about these two first-time state representatives comes out this week. Hannah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you, and congratulations on this piece. It's a really fascinating read.
Thank you.
Listeners, you can join our conversation with Hannah as well. Perhaps you've served as a state lawmaker before. Do you remember what your first year was like? And what motivated you to run? Give us a call and tell us about it at 800-639-2211. You can also send an email with your questions or your thoughts to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. So, Hannah, take us back to the beginnings of this piece. Where did the idea come from?
You know, not many folks have this opportunity, as you said, to be citizen legislators. So this story came up in the newsroom as an opportunity to have readers and Vermonters across the state get a view into the State House and what life is like under the Golden Dome. It was an opportunity to explore how the citizen legislature works, and it was a somewhat revealing exercise into what it's like for the hopes and dreams of first-time lawmakers when those dreams encounter the realities of a storied institution like the Vermont State House and the realities of being one member in a body of 180 people, and how possible it is to achieve the goals that you might come in with for your constituents or for your interests that you might have.
Yeah, and there's a lot of beloved traditions in that State House building, also a lot of big personalities too, and your two representatives that you follow have to contend with both of those forces throughout the legislative session. So, Hannah, set the stage for us about this particular legislative session. I mean, there was the big gains that Republicans got in both the House and the Senate. And if I recall correctly, there's all of this kind of like positive buzz at the beginning of the session about the bipartisanship that I think legislatures were actually really hoping to see.
Yeah, on January 8th, when the legislature convened, when these first years and all the state legislators gathered to be sworn into office for this biennium, that word bipartisanship was really buzzing around the halls of the Capitol building, and I think even further afield in the state. As you mentioned, the November election brought in a wave of new folks into the State House. It marked the end of a supermajority that the Democratic Party had in the State House for a number of years. So it had a more bipartisan makeup in the legislature. Representative Michael Booten, one of the two first years that is featured in this story, is one of those first-year Republican legislators who was part of that wave in the House of Representatives. So there was a lot of hope and kind of dreams of how this year would be different, how there would be more compromise made, how that would be playing out in both the House chamber, the Senate chamber, and between the still democratically run legislature and the Republican Scott administration, because there ultimately, for Vermont's laws to go into effect, there needs to be that collaboration ultimately between the legislature and the governor's office. So that was very much the energy on that first day of the session.
That's Vermont Edition is always in the State House on the first day of the session for a live show. It's one of my favorite shows of the year because it feels like the first day of school and everyone's just sort of radiating this energy and enthusiasm that does naturally start to wane as the months go by. Hannah, tell us about these two lawmakers that you followed throughout these past couple of months. Let's begin with the Democrat.
Sean Sweeney is a Democrat from Shelburne, and he represents Shelburne and St. George. He is someone who came into his position in the state legislature without a background in political office. His experience previously is more as an entrepreneur. He had run nightclubs. He had a career in film. He now owns and runs his own construction and home design business based in Shelburne. And he was approached by an outgoing member of the legislature to run for office. So he had a pretty competitive race in the Democratic primary and then not such a competitive race in the general election. And so that was his journey into the state legislature. He didn't go in with a kind of set list of policy priorities. He really thought of this as a year of learning, being a student of the process, wanting to get to know the folks in the building, trusting that the issues that he would be able to contribute to would kind of present themselves, and that would be the best path forward for him.
And then the Republican from Washington County.
That is Representative Michael Booten. In contrast, Michael Booten had quite a few years of experience in local government positions in Berry City, which is where he lives, and he was had served over 10 years on the city council in Berry City. He's currently the chair of the Berry School Board, and he ran for the state representative position after unexpectedly losing his city council position. When he won the state representative seat, he decided that he would go into the state house with a really kind of long list of goals that he wanted to accomplish this first year for his constituents. And that's an ambitious thing for a first-year legislator to go in with, especially as a member of the minority party. He was warned by friends and colleagues that that's a really big challenge to take on because of those two kind of factors, being a first year and being in that minority where you don't have the numbers to support you in terms of votes and kind of folks in the powerful positions to advance legislation along the way. So those are kind of their backgrounds as they stepped into the chamber on that first day and what they hoped to accomplish and how they approached these two seats.
And as you mentioned, both of these men had lives, careers, jobs, local appointments that they were balancing alongside their work as legislators. Now, of course, many of our state legislators are retired and can devote more of their time to the work of lawmaking, but many are not. What did you notice in the months that you were following them about that balance that they had to create between their work in Montpelier and their kind of quote-unquote regular lives?
It's a perennial challenge in a citizen legislature, and certainly not just in Vermont, but for all states that have a citizen legislature and a part-time legislature. Here in Vermont, the legislature meets for 4 to 5 months out of the year for 4 days out of that week. It's a really challenging schedule for folks to be able to meet. The amount of pay, the stipend that they receive is about $800 a week. It doesn't come with healthcare benefits. So to your point, it's really challenging kind of terms that isn't accessible to a lot of folks, especially if they might have limited resources, limited income. Maybe they have young children. It's a tough lifestyle. For Representative Sean Sweeney, as the owner of his business, he was able to kind of pass the reins to his staff for the session. He would go into his business on Mondays, check in, but really the business was running at a rate where he was able to step away, and that was kind of part of his calculus of why he felt it was the right time for him to run for office right now. Representative Booten, he works at National Life Group, the insurance company. He maintained his job there 1 day a week. That allowed him to keep his health insurance benefits, for example. He also just genuinely loves that job, loves the people he works with there. It allowed some continuity, but that's a lot to juggle during the year. So he's already back at National Life Group. Representative Sweeney's already back at his construction home design business. So it's a pretty relentless amount of work. Representative Booten described it as like trying to drink out of a fire hose, and especially in those early months, it's a lot to kind of recalibrate to.
Right. I remember in your article you write about the hundreds of emails that he was getting and having to make these decisions between, do I go and try to network in person with other lawmakers, or do I go home and just try to get through the emails?
Yeah, there's trade-offs that many folks have to grapple with, and as you mentioned, the outcome for the legislature's makeup is a lot of times the folks who are able to serve in these positions are trend older or are retired, because that is kind of more accessible to be able to juggle all of these really high demand responsibilities.
Well, your piece is dotted with some really wonderful details about the legislators' early days. I think of Michael Booten's footwear for his swearing in. You wrote that he was wearing Crocs and was maybe the only lawmaker to do so. What else do you remember about that time, those first couple weeks when you were following these two as they were kind of figuring out their new surroundings?
It's a steep learning curve. This is a building with a lot of procedural rules that even for folks who might have experience serving in local office, there are still unique twists to how the State House operates that can trip up even the most experienced former city councilors, for example. So there's that element of learning curves in that way, but there's also the aspect of trying to get to know all of the people who might be on the committee that you are assigned to. The committee element was a really interesting part to see play out. The committee assignments are decided on the first day and have huge implications for what a legislator's experience will be like for the rest of the session. It's where legislators spend a tremendous amount of their time throughout the months ahead. It's where they sit day in and day out and do the bulk of kind of the legislative work. So if they don't get kind of their first pick of where they hoped to be, if it's not an issue area that they know a tremendous amount about or might not have predisposed interest in, it can be really challenging to kind of pivot and become interested in. So Representative Booten, for example, didn't get his first choice, and it took a little while to come around to that, but the people for him were what really got him kind of were the silver lining of that committee assignment. He was really hoping for government and operations, but he got assigned to commerce and economic development. Sean Sweeney had hoped for the housing committee. Not surprising, given his background in home design and construction. He was assigned to Corrections and Institutions Committee, but the silver lining he found was that he was able to work with and learn from the most tenured member of the House of Representatives. So a really experienced person to see kind of the tricks of the trade, the kind of masterclass of legislative leadership. So in those first few weeks, there was a lot of kind of rolling with the punches that just came in from all directions, in that the relationship aspect, the legislative learning curve, it came from all directions.
Do you have questions about what it's like to be a state legislator in Vermont's House or Senate? Our guest, Hannah Bassett of 7 Days, has been following two local legislators for the past 6 months. If you have questions or thoughts, you can call in at 800-639-2211. And our email is vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. We have to take one quick break. We'll keep talking in just a moment. Stay with us.
Thanks for listening to Vermont Edition, where support comes from Vital, Vermont information technology leaders. Did you know that 98.9% of Vermonters share health data with their providers through the nonprofit Vital to support better care? Learn more at vitl.net/sharing.
Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are speaking today with Hannah Bassett. She's a reporter for 7 Days, and she has a new cover story coming out tomorrow about two first-time state legislators, a Democrat and a Republican. She shadowed them for the past 6 months as they found their way in Montpelier. You can join this conversation as well. Our phone lines are open, particularly if you have an experience similar to one of these lawmakers that we are discussing, or you have questions about what it's like to be in Montpelier in the State House. You can call in at 800-639-2211. Hannah, so you talked about how these two lawmakers were coming in to Montpelier at a time where there was this kind of significant shift in the balance of power there. Democrats still had the majority, but it was no longer a super majority. And there was a bit more bipartisanship that was not just encouraged, but necessary due to that shift in power. How did you see these two lawmakers fitting themselves into that situation? And particularly, I wonder if there is any benefit in being in the minority.
It's challenging when, as a member of the minority party, in the current legislature, the minority party is the same party as the governor. So in that way, there is a kind of a power dynamic that's advantageous there. But for Representative Michael Booten, for example, from his stance, a lot of the time it was a very frustrating dynamic, because a lot of the committee chairs, for example, were not Republican members. A lot of the committee makeup was not majority Republican. All of those decisions about who would be serving as chairs of committees, which party would have the majority share of members on committees, those are decisions made by the party that has control of the chamber in this session. That's the Democratic Party. And those kind of dynamics are really influential about which bills are kind of advanced and which bills are given the opportunity to move forward for votes on the House floor. There's kind of a phrase in the State House of kind of bills being left up on committee room walls. So Michael Booten was introducing these bills that he felt were important for Berry City and his constituents. He was doing what he felt was his part, kind of all that he could as a legislator, but they weren't advancing. And he felt it was in part because there was not that buy-in from the there weren't kind of the numbers to kind of pull it forward for him, and that was because of that just dynamic of being in the minority party.
Were there any lawmakers who could offer some advice, a different way to do things, or to introduce important issues or change on important issues?
Representative Booten went to Speaker Krawinski, actually. Speaker Krawinski is a Democratic member. She's the leader of the House of Representatives, and that is, I think, an example of that bipartisanship in action. I don't know if that necessarily would have happened in years past or would have happened between any member, but I think is a symbol of Representative Booten's interest in or openness to crossing those party lines, or Speaker Kerwinski's openness to working with the other party as well. Representative Booten went to Speaker Kerwinski to get tips on how to move his legislation forward, and he felt that Speaker Kerwinski really took that meeting in good faith and offered tips in return that he took to heart and applied throughout the session to do his best to advance that legislation. Those are, tools he's going to keep in his toolbox moving into next year, and I think throughout whatever his career might be as a legislator. So those are crossing the aisle moments that were indicative of that bipartisanship effort this year.
Did you witness either of these men have a moment of disillusionment or a period where, reality of the job really sunk in when they had to, say, vote a way that they might not have thought that they would have due to politics or something else of that sort?
The partisan dynamic was challenging. We've spoken about that minority dynamic for Representative Booten. Representative Sweeney, the Democrat, is a member of the majority party, but still that came with its own challenges for him in a way, finding his place within the party. There were votes at times where he wanted to vote his conscience, vote in a way that might have been different from what the party leadership would have been pulling for, and there was a friction there that was uncomfortable for him at times. And there was one particular vote towards the end of the session that really did seem to pain him ultimately afterwards. He'd worked with the Rural Caucus, a group kind of on the side, to introduce an amendment to the big housing bill of the session. And he got kind of whipped, as they say in State House kind of jargon. He got sort of pressured to turn against that amendment and vote against kind of initiative that he'd worked on, that he believed in, because it wasn't what the party had kind of wanted to support. And so he went with that. He did turn against that initiative, but afterwards that really didn't sit well with him. So he learned from that. He kind of sat with that. And the next time that the party came to him and asked him to vote against something that he wanted to vote for, or, vice versa, he stuck to what he believed was right in that instance. So those party dynamics and trying to, not burn the limited political capital that one might have in this small state and small institution is really challenging, even if you are in that majority party.
It's clear you know these two first-time lawmakers very well at this point. How much time did you spend with them, and how did you earn their trust?
A tremendous amount of time. They were very, very generous with their time with me. At the beginning of the session, before it even started, I reached out to Representative Sweeney and Representative Booten to get their thoughts on the eve of their swearing in, to kind of get their first day of school kind of emotions on the record. And I reached out to a number of other representatives too. At the time, it was sort of betting blind on who would be doing what this session. So they were tremendously gracious right from the beginning, and they continued to be very, very kind to share their time with me in the hallway, in the committee rooms. The State House itself is a very open building, so that is something that is open to any member of the public, but advantageous to the press as well. But Representative Sweeney and Booten continued to share their time with me in the cafeteria after hours. It was only possible because of their openness with the highs and lows throughout the session.
Was there ever a moment where you felt like your access was denied, or there was information about the broader legislative process that you couldn't access?
there's certainly some caucus meetings, for example. First, there were some kind of first-year gatherings that were these private forums for first years to be kind of cathartically sharing out their experiences, their hopes, their dreams, their sort of bonding experiences for each other, very trust-based forums. Those were not areas that I accessed, but I was able to speak with Representative Sweeney or Representative Booten right afterwards and right before to talk with them about what that was like. And then I would talk with other representatives who were there as well to kind of cross-reference those experiences and make sure I was getting different perspectives, make sure it all lined up if I wasn't able to be there myself.
And one of the big issues at the State House this session, as our listeners are certainly familiar with, is the debate over education reform. That issue ended up pushing the end of the legislative session to mid-June. Did either of these lawmakers play a role in that, or feel, or did they speak with you about the issue of education reform?
They both spoke with me about education reform, and they both played really interesting roles in it at two very different junctures. When the education bill was passing out of the House of Representatives, Representative Booten, the Republican, he broke with his caucus at the time and voted in support of the education bill. At the time, the Democratic Party was the caucus really trying to pull together the votes to make sure it could pass into the Senate and keep that reform effort alive. Representative Booten, as folks can read in the article, explained his vote at the time. He voted for it, but it was not so much a vote endorsing the content of the bill at the time, but a vote to keep it alive so that there would be more time and more opportunity for it to continue evolving into something that could become better, could become more, could kind of return to the policies that Governor Scott had first proposed that Representative Booten felt would be the better solution in his eyes. So that was a really unexpected turn. The night before that vote, he had been a firm no vote. He had used actually ChatGPT to analyze this really long bill.
Really?
And, these are really dense bills. In this, it's sort of a glimpse into how folks are legislating in this modern era when they have all these demands, like we were talking about. Some are turning to ChatGPT if they don't feel like they have the time or the capacity to read through it and do that analysis themselves on short notice. Representative Sweeney, though, just to answer the other half of your question, in the past few weeks when the bill came to its final vote, this was when Representative Sweeney kind of stood his line against the party's push to kind of turn his vote one last time. He voted against the education bill. All of the constituent outreach that he was receiving was to oppose the bill. And the Democratic caucus at the time was really pushing to get this bill passed. It had taken a tremendous amount of work by leadership to get it to this point. They really wanted to get it across the finish line. But Representative Sweeney was of the mindset that, all of the constituents that he represents as a representative were saying no, so he was going to hold that line, and that's what he did. So it was interesting to see in these two key junctures of this education bill, they took kind of the unexpected votes that you might not have thought if you kind of looked at these two guys on paper.
Fascinating. Well, let's go to the phones here. We have Johnny in New Pumford calling in. Johnny, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, this is a question for Hannah. Hannah, could you share any moments from the session when you were reminded that the legislators have full lives outside of Montpelier that they're trying to balance with their very full schedules as public servants? Thanks very much.
You have Representative Sweeney, at the beginning of the session, he had intended to drive home to spend each night with his wife in Shelburne and kind of maintain that aspect of his normal life. But pretty early on in the session, he realized that wasn't going to be as attainable as he thought it was. So he ended up boarding in Montpelier during the week because that commute back and forth really ate into that precious time of meeting with people, reviewing bills, doing work that was piling up really quickly. So his lifestyle changed dramatically in a way that he didn't predict would on that eve of the session. Representative Booten, I know early on, didn't anticipate that the hours of the session were going to be quite as long as they were. They really can stretch from 9 a.m. to 5:36 even easily on the days that folks are in Montpelier. That was much longer than he had kind of anticipated when he arrived on that first day. So for him, that could mean his dog, his beloved German Shepherd, Leah, he would need to make arrangements for his family to take care of. So there's the big things and the little things that can impact the lives of these legislators in kind of reshaping their worlds around this job while the session is going on between January and June.
Well, thank you, Johnny, for the call. We also have a question from Sasha in Burlington who wants to know that as a reporter, how do you build a relationship with lawmakers without crossing a line into, a friendship after having spent so much time with them, or just letting your own personal feelings about politics getting involved in your reporting?
I reiterate often that these conversations are on the record. Make sure that they understand these are conversations that will be kind of used in the reporting. If there is information that they want to disclose or have held private, that needs to be named up front. These are kind of journalistic boundaries that I didn't want to have lost in these many, many, many conversations that were relatively informal in tone, just in the fact that we spoke so many times throughout the session, throughout any given day to get these smaller moments of their lives. But it was important to make sure that they realized, I was not spending this much time with them as a friend, but this is sort of my job and they're doing their job. And this was, I was there to help the public, 7 Days readers, the folks listening to Vermont Public right now get a better understanding of what it's like to be a citizen legislator through their eyes.
Hannah Bassett is a reporter with 7 Days. Her story that we've been discussing this hour is part of 7 Days Ways and Means project. It comes out tomorrow. Hannah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Coming up, we are going to be talking about security threats that local and national lawmakers face these days. We'll be joined by State Senator Keisha Hinsdale. We're also going to be talking specifically about the recent tragedy in Minnesota, where their former House Speaker and her husband were shot and killed. Now, this might be a particularly difficult conversation to hear, so please keep that subject matter in mind as you continue to listen. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. On June 14th, longtime Minnesota state lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark, were shot and killed inside their home. Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette were also shot and wounded in their home. John is still in the hospital in serious but stable condition, and his wife is now home. The suspect in these crimes, who's since been arrested, had made a hit list with dozens of names on it, including Democratic lawmakers like Hortman and Hoffman and abortion rights advocates. Melissa Hortman was first elected to the Minnesota House in 2004. She was a strong advocate for education reform, the environment, and paid family and medical leave. She went to college on the East Coast at Boston University, and she worked for Senators Al Gore and John Kerry after graduating. She was also an attorney, and she and her husband had 2 adult children. She also knew multiple members of Vermont's state legislature, including Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale, who joins us now. She represents the Chittenden Southeast District. Welcome, and I am so sorry for the loss of your friend.
Thank you. It's important, but also hard to hear all of that repeated back about her life. But thank you for spotlighting her on the show. I think it's really important.
Can you tell us more about her?
Yeah. Well, what's hard for me is to separate finding out the news about her passing from then telling the rest of the story about her incredible life and, being able to call her a friend. On June 15th, it must have been, the kids were fully occupied and I happened to open Instagram, of course. And the news was just a picture of Melissa and the senator who'd also been shot, and not a lot of details at the time. And so I just kept looking for what hospital is she in, what's her condition. And then the director of our Vermont Democratic Party, May Hanlon, called me without knowing I was friends with her and said, I'm calling all of the high profile women in the legislature and in politics, just to let you know what happened. And I said, I'm looking at the news, and I want to know more about how she's doing. At that point, it just never crossed my mind that she was dead, that they weren't in a hospital because they never survived. And her parents actually said something similar in an interview. She was really full of life and passion and conviction. And we've seen people survive very messy, violent attacks, but this was so deeply premeditated, so calculated that it took a long time for me to process, this assassination, this fully premeditated assassination of a friend.
And so when you got that call, you thought, oh, she's still alive. She'll be okay. And unfortunately, as we know now, she was not. Neither was her husband. You two had known each other for quite some time. When did you first meet?
Yeah, we met during welcome weekend, before we started our Kennedy School graduate program together, the Mid-Career Masters of Public Administration. She was actually a 2017-2018 class graduate because, or I should say, started in 2016. Similar actually to our former speaker, Mitzi Johnson in Vermont. There are politicians who take 2 semesters outside of their session and cross 2 different classes. So, in fact, I've been in conversation just this weekend with the class of 2017 graduates who knew her well and were working on at least a scholarship effort. I think it would make sense for an institution like the Harvard Kennedy School to have some kind of memorial to someone lost to political violence in this country who was a graduate. But certainly, everyone's memories to a T are about somebody who really knew what was right in the world, even when it was hard, and never had an unkind word to say about anybody, but also had conviction, also would call people out or call them in when needed. And so I've talked to other legislators in Minnesota and colleagues, and all we can do is keep having these conversations with her in our head. What would she say? What would she do? I was doing that even while she was alive. She was a really great legislative leader to know and to look up to as a role model.
And in the previous conversation we were just having on Vermont Edition, I was talking with 7 Days reporter Hannah Bassett a lot about bipartisanship at the State House in Vermont, and how the balance of power sort of shifted this year as more Republicans were elected. want to compare that for a moment to Minnesota, where their legislature was exactly evenly split until, of course, this horrific act came to pass. But I just wonder how you think about that, about political violence occurring in a place where there is also such bipartisanship on display.
I mean, Minnesota certainly is a bit more metropolitan than Vermont, but she and I easily bonded over serving in states that are pretty folksy, where you tend to know a lot of people. It was actually really touching to hear that one of the seasoned police officers who was responding to the shooting of her colleague in the Senate actually said someone should go check on Melissa Hortman because, she lives in the same neighborhood, and this seems like it might be an attack on a lot of politicians. And, we look out for each other that way. And when we met, Representative Hortman was in the minority, and they gained back power right after she left our program and she became the Speaker of the House. And we got to see her power on full display. She would call out Republican white men for not listening to Black women, the handful of Black women in their legislature when they were speaking. She just really had a deep sense of justice. And so it was even more painful, and probably my third thought as I was processing the news that she had actually passed was, what's going on with my own safety? What I'm looking out the window. I'm, thinking about my kids. She is somebody who would always find compromise with conviction. I think one of her last public conversations before she was killed was talking about how hard it was for her to reach a budget compromise and to vote for that, but how important it was to her as well. And I hope when we try to remember her legacy writ large or at the Kennedy School, we uplift people who are trying to find that spirit of compromise and do what's right for the most people, because that's how she lived her life. And you can hear it in what her kids have said about her. She just always thought the best of everyone.
Yeah. You brought up your concerns over your own family's safety. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. In Minnesota, the alleged shooter had this long list of people's full names and addresses, including many lawmakers. And Vermont is such a small state. It's very easy to know exactly where people live, what their daily lives are like without even trying much. How do you think that we can keep our legislators safe at a time when everybody's information is already online and for public viewing?
Yeah, I mean, we've been thinking about it more and more. I think it was 2014 or perhaps earlier when we started getting serious about firearm safety legislation. That's when Representative Kaya Morris was harassed in her home in Bennington. I had an experience where someone tried to run me off the road in one of the back roads of Chittenden County that I thought might be related to the gun bills. And from there, I fast forward to now Congresswoman Ballant and I talking to the FBI about a white supremacist cell in New Hampshire that had targeted us. It was very small and it resolved itself. But we are having to think about this more and more, and it's a shame. It is one of the many factors why people think twice about becoming those new legislators that folks just heard about, that the excitement, especially if you are a woman or person of color, though this person also targeted a male senator, that kind of violence is yet another drawback to having a representative democracy.
Right. And speaking of what we as individuals can do to keep people safe who are in the public eye, who are legislators. I keep thinking, too, about how this tragedy in Minnesota comes directly after a presidential election cycle in which Donald Trump faced 2 different assassination attempts. And, presidential candidates have the full force of the Secret Service looking out for them. And even they couldn't keep this politically motivated violence from happening. Vermont, we have our sergeant at arms. We have the Capitol Police, numerous local police forces. But it sounds like what you're saying is that at some point there's a limit to what can be done there, and we have to look elsewhere, such as with the laws that we make.
Well, and just the culture that we build.
Yeah.
You look back at quotes of George Bush saying, Barack Obama's a very nice man. I don't think he's a terrorist. And when high-profile leaders stand up for the humanization and dignity of other elected officials or high-profile leaders of any kind, and don't let that dehumanization in language and stereotyping happen, we're all better off. So I think it's important to never cheer on increasingly hostile or violent criticism of an elected official, really of anyone. There are people who do far more dangerous jobs regularly than we do. But I keep going back to thinking about her husband, Mark, very accomplished guy. I remember meeting him at graduation. He adored his wife. He wanted her to be so successful. People think twice if they think that might end both of their lives to support their loved one in elected office, if it would leave their kids without parents. So, we don't sign up for this. We're not expecting to pay the ultimate sacrifice. We're not trained for that in elected office.
Right. You're not the only person at the State House in Montpelier who knew Melissa Hortman. How have you and your fellow lawmakers been supporting one another?
Yeah, well, first of all, I remember the day we all found out. Maybe it was June 14th when we all found out, because it was the middle of the night, and by that morning we knew more, and it was the No King's Day protest. And from that day on, I had posted how much shock I was in, and that I had known her. And people I didn't know, or people who I had just a acquaintance with came up to say, I'm so sorry, it's been affecting me too. So, you didn't have to know her to see the power of silencing this particular voice, and also how frightening it is to attack someone because of their political beliefs at this level. But yeah, what's really, my mother's neighbor said, and she lives in South Burlington now, said, when I heard the news about this woman, I thought of your daughter. I thought of Jill Krowinski, I thought of the other high-profile women that I served with, some who knew her from being speaker or, having that ultimate high-profile position, some from political gatherings, me from my academic trajectory. But she was somebody who was seen as a bright light in the country. And to lose someone like that, but then know that all of us have had those threats, have bonded over small gestures that we had to read into very deeply for our own safety. You never want to go there, but I remember thinking what Melissa would say is, it's okay to be scared. It's okay to hug your kids tight. You should be safe, but you can't be silent. You cannot be silent in moments like this. And that's what gave me the courage to get up and out of the house that day.
State Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale, thank you so much for speaking with us about your friend, Melissa Hortman. We really appreciate it. I know it must have been difficult to talk about her today.
Thank you. It's just important. It's important, and I hope people will still participate in our democracy to the fullest, even though it's getting a bit scary to do so.
Well, that is all the time that we have for today's show. Please join us tomorrow on Vermont Edition. We're going to be approaching the world from a bit of a different angle through the lens of poetry. We have 4 conversations that we recorded with poets from our region back in April, which was National Poetry Month. And we're going to be re-airing portions of those conversations on the show tomorrow. They shine a light in their own way on some of the major events that we as Americans have been grappling with over the past couple months. And each of these poets also provide some suggestions for how to create space for creativity and reflection in your own life. So I really hope you can tune in. They've been really heartening for me to listen back to as we prepare tomorrow's episode. All right, that is it for today's show. As always, you can weigh in or pitch us ideas by emailing vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Our show today was directed by Aaliyah Papes. John Ahrens is our managing producer. Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro are our producers. Our intern is Callie Canuxerl. Today's call screener was Rick Barrett, and our theme music is by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.